Hi, my name is Mike Milinkovich, Executive Director of the Eclipse Foundation. Welcome to Upstream, and thank you very much to Tidelift for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. My talk is about the impending changes that are going to hit the software industry as a whole and the open source community in part over the next couple of years as government regulation becomes a fact of life. So, without further ado, open source one, now comes the hard part. So I think everybody here understands and agrees that open source software has become an essential part of today's world. And that's largely because, first of all, software has become an integral part of the world. Pretty much every aspect of today's societies and economies are being run by software. And that's really been driving all of the innovation, or at least most of the innovation that's been happening around the world for the last 20 years. And then, of course, open source gobbled up software. So if software has become critically important, then open source software has become just as important. And there's lots of reasons why that's true, but fundamentally, open source is just the world's most effective way to collaborate on innovation. And I really think that the open source community that we've built over the last 30 years is a miracle. It drives so much innovation. And the way that it does through completely frictionless, peer-oriented innovation and collaboration around the globe, I think is just fantastic. And that really is going to change as a result of the fact that it's become so important. So 80 to 90% of software applications today are built on top of open source. That's an incredible number. And it's gotten so important that even, old, lack of a better phrase, it is 100 years old, but old companies, mature companies, conservative companies, if you will, like Mercedes, will say things like, today you just simply cannot develop software without open source. So open source has become absolutely integral. And the reason why is because open source technologies are game changers. For those who don't know these two gentlemen in the picture, Tim Berners-Lee and Vint Cerf, respectively, the inventors of the World Wide Web and the internet. And the world that we live in is fundamentally based on top of free technologies. And that's become so critically important to how technology is evolved, but also adopted and brought forward for entirely new initiatives. And you can see that today in AI and LLMs. A lot of the energy that's going into that is actually happening in open source. And this has really put developers front and center in terms of how innovation happens. A book by Stephen O'Grady, The New Kingmakers, really talked about how developers, and to a certain degree, this is led by open source, have really changed how technologies evolve and are adapted and adopted in enterprises and throughout their product organizations. And this has really put this, like I said, developers at the front and center of how innovation happens in the world. But with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that that's really a big part of what needs to be discussed here, is that as developers, as open source software, as software in general has become so integral to our lives, with that great power becomes at least some amount of responsibility. Now, I think you're familiar, many of you might be familiar with the notion that as a software developer, open source software developer or maintainer, the license says, I'm not providing you with any warranty and I'm accepting no liability for your use of the software. Unfortunately, that is actually not quite as uniformly true as you might imagine. The simple fact of the matter is that software licenses, including open source software licenses, cannot override the law. Or put it a different way, you can never contract away the law. So that's why many open source licenses have in them a phrase that says, to the extent permitted by law, ... I'm not providing you a warranty or accepting any liability. And what that means is that the obligations of developers have always been a little bit more than we perhaps thought, just based on reading the licenses. And that's about to change even more fundamentally as new laws and regulations come into effect around the world. The second major trend I want to talk about that I think is really helping drive a lot of what's going on here is that simply as software has become more important and the digital world has become so important to our lives, criminals and cybercrime have really taken root, to the extent that cybercrime would be today the world's third largest economy if it was measured as a GDP. So the amount of money that's being made in cybercrime is absolutely stupendous, to the point where we're looking at $10.5 trillion in damages by 2025. That's an enormous amount of money that is out there, and that's harming consumers and businesses around the world. And to a large degree, what's seeing the largest growth in the cybercrime, we've heard of all kinds of things, identity theft, ransomware, and so on, but supply chain hacks are becoming more and more prevalent to the point where they're now growing at 742% a year. And the interesting thing, of course, too, is supply chain hacks are not just about money. There's also a large interest in them by state actors, because a supply chain hack can be a great way to get behind the firewalls and exploit information or obtain information illegitimately by attacking the software supply chain. So what do we mean by a software supply chain? Well, this is a picture from Salsa being developed by OpenSSF that basically talks about the fact that, this picture should be pretty self-explanatory for anybody who's been involved in software, developing source code, then you build it, adding in a bunch of dependencies, you package that up and you ship it to whoever your consumers or users are. And at each one of these steps, there is a certain class of attacks that can be made against the software supply chain. But the one that's most interesting, of course, are dependencies. And the reason why is that dependencies are recursive and can go very, very deep. And then so the supply chain issues that can happen at one level are then duplicated all the way down. So no matter how far you go down, there's this notion that there could be vectors of attack on the supply chain. And that's really very concerning to anybody who's involved in software, because it means that it's very, very complicated to try to mitigate any risks or protect the supply chain throughout the entire chain. So this is a really big problem, and it's multiplied by the simple fact that the maintainers of the supply chain, the people that are working on these packages, are, as we've all seen from the XKCD comic, very, very, very few in many cases. Now, everybody's seen this comic, I'm sure, and it really kind of captures the idea that our modern world, in many ways, is just teetering on, very, very small teams. But unfortunately, this picture is actually wildly optimistic. If you take a look, and this is taken from the Open Source Security podcast and their related blog. Highly recommend these guys if you're interested in learning more about software security. And this is on NPM, but they've done similar analyses on Linux and other packages to really look at how many maintainers are working on the packages. And in the case of NPM, it's incredibly small. It's asymptotically close to 1. Which is a Pareto curve on steroids. So you really have a very, very large number of packages, in this case, something like 18 million plus packages that are being maintained by one person. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because there's often one person that's maintaining multiple packages. Apparently, the median is somewhere around 0.8 maintainers per package. Now, of course, if you're looking at this and you have any familiarity with NPM, I'm sure you're going, well, wait a second, NPM is huge. Surely this is skewed because of the sheer size and scale and of NPM and the fact that many of the packages are very small. But if you take a look at the graph, when you just look at the top 5% of the NPM packages, and this is top 5% as measured by downloads, it hardly changes at all. You still have millions of packages that are maintained by one developer. And this means that fundamentally we have a resource and sustainability problem across all of these packages that make up our global software supply chain. And this has come to, of course, the sustainability has become an issue, or recognized as an issue, for going on a decade. It really started with the Heartbleed OpenSSL bug back in 2014. It's almost 9 years ago now. And it really drove home to many people that open source had become critical infrastructure. But it really was recognized, to a certain degree, that of course OpenSSL is a fundamental piece of the security infrastructure. So if there's a bug in that, then yes, of course, that's going to really impact enterprises and services around the world. But it was really the Log4Shell bug that happened in late 2021 that was really a game changer from the perspective of governments, and to a certain degree enterprises, because nobody ever expected a massively severe CVE from something as innocuous as a logging framework for Java. And when they started looking for, okay, where is this thing? It was literally everywhere. So the conclusion, or the lesson that was learned from there, is that open source is everywhere. And as we saw earlier, it's making up 80 to 90% of all applications, and in similar numbers for products. It's not surprising that we all knew it was everywhere, but now governments are coming to the realization that it's everywhere. And it's really, really hard to figure out which pieces of open source software might be the ones that are going to cause you problems. So open source is everywhere, and it's dangerous. So here we are, and by the way, 18 months later, since the Log4j bug was first identified, and the patches to fix it were made available immediately. But Sonatype, who manage the Maven Central repository, also report on the percentage of downloads that are still using the vulnerable versions of Log4j. And this was taken a week and a half ago. And at that point, we're still seeing 32% of all of the downloads for our Log4j are still using the vulnerable version. And what does that mean? It means that no matter how hard we work on the open source community to mitigate problems, it's not at all clear that the adopters and users of our code are going to move fast enough to really mitigate all of the risks. But this has led to a series of policy conclusions that I think governments are grappling with everywhere around the world, which is that open source is ubiquitous. Open source is critical, not only critical to infrastructure, but it's also critical to innovation and future economic prosperity. It's been demonstrated that open source can harm consumers, can definitely harm businesses, and it is currently unregulated and unmanaged. So unsurprisingly, when governments notice a problem, they come with policy solutions. And that's really what we're starting to see now. And this is happening around the world. So there's legislation coming our way, both in the United States. Some of that has been known for a while, like the Biden White House executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity from 2021. Then there's also the act that created CISA and established that agency. But then there's also things that are happening in Europe that we're gonna talk about as we go through this. Now, one thing I'll say is that the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy that was just launched last month is definitely showing that the U.S. is on the path to regulating the software industry as a whole. But one of the things that I think that they're getting right is, at least, we haven't seen the actual draft legislation yet, but at a strategy level, what they've gotten right is that they're not implicating the open source developers and projects themselves. They're going to say that the organizations that monetize the open source code are going to be the ones that are going to be on the hook. That is not the case in Europe. With the European Cyber Resilience Act, which was the draft was published back in October. It's now in the political process, going through amendments in various European Parliament committees and through the European Council. And this is actually legislating conformance to a set of standards for all products that are going to be made, all software products made available in Europe in a few years. And what is it doing? It is really tackling or really applying the CE mark regime to all of software. Now, those of you who are, you might have noticed this mark on the back of a piece of electronics equipment. You might even have seen it on children's toys. But the CE mark regime is the mechanism by which Europe legislates conformance to standards, primarily safety standards or regulatory standards for things like radios and the like, across many product families and industries in Europe. And what Europe is going to be doing is applying the CE mark regulatory regime to all software, including software embedded in devices, but pure software products made available in the European market. So what does this mean for open source projects and communities? So we've taken a long, hard look at this at the Eclipse Foundation, and the things that we know we have to do are document the development processes, release and maintenance processes for every single project we have at the Eclipse Foundation, and do this in a way which is conformant with the requirements of the Cyber Resilience Act. Then for each project individually, and put this into perspective, we have about 425 projects at the Eclipse Foundation. For each one of these projects, we're going to have to certify that the project conforms to the processes that we've laid out, and to legally attest, actually sign a legal document that each project conforms to that. And then for a number of our projects, projects which fall into what they call critical or highly critical products, including things like operating systems, we're going to have to engage with a third-party auditor, external auditor, to provide an audit to make sure that the project has been produced in accordance with the CRA requirements and the processes that we've laid down. And this has to be repeated for every release of every project at the Eclipse Foundation and in open source in general. So this is, and in case you haven't sort of gathered this is a very waterfall style of process, which actually in some ways is quite inconsistent with how modern software development practices happen. And who does this apply to? So this is not just if you are a European company or a European open source foundation. This applies to all software made available on the European single market. And made available in today's world is, if there's a download link that somebody can get to. So this is going to apply to developers, all providers of software and digital services, and online marketplaces and repositories. Think things like Maven Central, NPM, and the like. And so there is a carve-out for open source in the CRA that I think a lot of people that have even heard of the CRA have read this and go, okay, this is not that big a deal because look, there's this carve-out because it says that open source software developed or supplied outside the course of a commercial activity is not covered. And of course, it's provided under an open source license. This is not commercial. Unfortunately, under European law, commercial activity does not mean what you think it means. If it passes these three tests, it is considered commercial. So is it provided on a regular basis? Does it have like regular releases? Is it commercial quality? And is it intended to be used in a commercial setting? So think of the Apache web server, think of Linux, think of the Eclipse IDE. These are all things which would certainly be considered to have been developed and supplied under a commercial activity based on those sorts of definitions. So if that's true, then what was this recital 10 actually intended to exclude? And unfortunately, and just to be clear, I've spoken to the authors of the CRA work at the European Commission, and what they mean to exclude are hobbyists and charities, and that's it. So pretty much all the open source software around the world that we think of as being important and relevant will have the full weight of the CE mark compliance regime envisaged under the CRA falling within its scope. So what are some of the potential consequences? And actually, before I get to that, I just should mention that We, the Eclipse Foundation, other organizations like the OSI, Open Forum Europe, Linux Foundation Europe, and others are all working very hard through the political processes in Europe to try to get some of these things changed. But unfortunately, we now are within the realm of politics, and it's unclear how this is all going to work out. But based on the draft as it is today, some of the potential consequences that we might see is Europe might get cut off from open source. It's a perfectly rational conclusion if you are an open source maintainer to say simply, I'm making this available for free. There's no way I can get money to do all this added work. Sorry, Europe, you're not allowed to use my code. And so that is one potential outcome. It's obviously unintended, but I don't think that some people understand that the vast majority of open source code is being developed by people that are just barely hanging on in terms of their obligations to develop and maintain that code. Another possibility is that European producers, and that includes the Eclipse Foundation, by the way, because we moved our legal domicile to Europe a couple of years ago, we're going to be put at a disadvantage relative to other peers that have less stringent requirements. Now, of course, as soon as they make their software available in Europe, then they have to conform as well. But there's certainly, this is certainly going to be an added burden to organizations like the Eclipse Foundation. Think also, the Open Document Foundation, KDE, and others. Another possibility is that the package distribution sites, think Maven Central, NPM, PyPy, and the like, would just say you can't download our stuff from Europe. And they're offering free services upon which lots of the open source ecosystem rely upon. There's really no motivation for them to accept additional risk or liability coming out of the CRA. And finally, there's certainly a risk that European businesses will stop contributing to open source projects. And we're already seeing a bit of a chill in some cases in Eclipse projects. And it's because none of the big companies in Europe who have very strong compliance programs, of course, really understand right now what the risk of contributing to open source is going to be under the CRA. And this is going to be extremely damaging to the innovation economy in Europe that was just really starting to understand the power of open collaboration for driving innovation. It also runs counter to the stated goals of numerous European strategies, particularly those related to digital sovereignty like Gaia X, Katina X, data spaces, and so on, which have explicitly made open source a fundamental part of their innovation strategy. So I guess this is an example of be careful what you wish for somebody who's been involved in the open source community and ecosystem for going on 20 years. It's been fantastic to see how powerful the open source model for coming together to collaborate on creating new and interesting technologies and maintaining essential technologies. This has been an incredibly powerful and successful model around the world. And unfortunately, oftentimes with great power comes great responsibility. And that does seem to be what's coming our way. And I guess last closing thought, is this all bad? And to a certain degree, there's part of me that's always kind of marveled at the fact that the software industry as a whole has remained unregulated for as long as it has, given how important software is to our everyday lives. So I'm certainly not surprised to see some amount of regulation coming towards the software industry. But I do think that driving that same level of regulation into the open source communities, projects, developers, and maintainers, I think that is really inherently a bad idea. I think that this is going to damage innovation around the world, and I think it's going to be counterproductive. And honestly, the unintended consequences of this legislation, are too broad to fathom at this point. And so let's hope that the political process will run its course and we can get innovations or get modifications into the CRA before it's too late, and we can actually turn this from a clearly, I think, a net negative into at least a net positive. And with that, thank you. I really hope that you found this talk interesting, and I once again want to thank Tidelift for the opportunity to speak. Thank you very much.